Welcome everybody as you're getting let in. My name's Christy Spire. I'm the Nature Education Team Leader here at Green Adelaide, and you've joined us for a webinar, making sure you're in the right room, on exploring the full value of street trees in metropolitan Adelaide. We like to start these webinars off with acknowledging the country that we're coming together from. So I have the pleasure of being on Kaurna country, Ngadlu Tampanthi, Ngadlu Kaurna, Yatanga, Imparenthi, and we acknowledge this means that we acknowledge that we meet on Kaurna country, and we have the privilege of working together with traditional owners and current owners of the lands and waters of the Adelaide region. And we really hold their connection and their ways of managing and protecting land, waters and community. And we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging as well, and just thank them for working together with us in all the complexities of that. This session is being recorded, as those who've joined us over the year will know, and will be available on the Green Adelaide YouTube channel. This is actually the 10th instalment of our seminar series for 2025 and the final one. We run these to help share the great work that's happening across Adelaide to make it cooler, greener, wilder and more climate resilient. And we know that each one of you that are online today contribute to that in one way or another. So today there's not huge amounts of interaction, but you are invited to ask questions through the chat or the Q&A boxes if that's appearing on your teams at any time throughout the session with John today, and we will answer as many of those as we can at the end of the session, and if we don't get to them, we'll email you back. So today, as I mentioned, we are exploring the full value of street trees in metropolitan Adelaide. As we all know, street trees do so much more than provide shade and beauty. They're critical to our city's resilience, biodiversity and community wellbeing. Yet truly understanding and communicating their full value is no simple task. Today we're joined by applied economist, Dr. John Kandulu from Flinders University, who will guide us through how we can better capture the economic, social and environmental benefits of our urban trees so they are truly valued in decision making. With over 15 years of experience in natural resource and environmental management policy, John brings deep expertise in using economic tools to shape greener, fairer and more livable cities. So it's our pleasure to introduce you to John today. So I'll stop sharing and let you share, John, for 40 minutes, and then we'll have the time for questions at the end. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Christy.
Pleasure.
So yes, today I'll talk about how we can explore the full value of street trees in metropolitan Adelaide. This work started with the Environment Institute at the University of Adelaide with colleagues from the Environment Institute, and there'll be a link to a technical report that will be shared later, so I won't dwell too much on the technical aspects, but so much on the discussion around the challenges around valuing street trees and some of the ways in which we've addressed them, some of the challenges that remain unaddressed, but also some of the reflections from conducting this work. So just a bit of background. There's a strong policy commitment within Greater Adelaide to actually improve urban green spaces, Adelaide's green spaces, but there's also a decline in green spaces. Now, South Australia's 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide and some of the local council climate adaptation strategies include aspirations to mitigate flooding, to reduce energy use. And this is in line with some of the climate change commitments statewide, but also nationwide. But I think exactly how do we operationalize or achieve some of these targets when we're still seeing persistent decline in trees remains a challenge. So speaking to local councils, there's a need for tools that will help councils quantify some of these benefits from green spaces, including street trees, to actually be able to implement improvements in these assets, in these streetscapes. Now, the challenge comes about because in actually developing a business case for increasing the population of street trees, budget justifications require that there's an underpinning value proposition, typically underpinned by a benefit cost analysis, which means you're monetizing benefits, you're monetizing costs in order to compare them to prove if there's a positive return on investment. And so will it benefit society more than it'll cost society by actually increasing the population of street trees? And a benefit cost ratio is usually required to justify such an investment. Now, the challenge comes about because if you're trying to compare why you should invest in urban green spaces versus, for example, housing in the face of housing shortages or supermarkets or playgrounds, is that the benefits from if you plant a tree today accrue over a very long term, whereas if you put housing or supermarkets, benefits are more upfront compared to these trees. But there's also a risk in terms of you could lose them to fire damage and others. And so there's a risk in terms of how do you guarantee that you will get a tree that will grow to full maturity in order to realize the benefits of that investment fully. So we came to a realization that councils do need valuation tools that are simple, defensible, but also quick to use to be able to do these assessments. And that was the main motivation for this work. Now, further background shows that a lot of studies have actually provided evidence in support of benefits for trees. Flood mitigation, so this is stormwater management, deep-rooted trees, promoting stormwater filtration, reducing unmanaged stormwater runoff, mitigating flooding, energy use reductions. This is usually from cooling. And so less need for running air conditioning, for example, lower energy consumption, and there's an associated lower carbon emission associated with lower energy use. Health benefits, so from urban heating island effects, we're looking at less heat stress, heat-related illnesses from cooling. Also promotes activity, walking along streets. And there's a physical health benefit associated with that. And a lot of studies have mentioned a lot of these benefits qualitatively, but the challenge becomes we're working within a system that sees dollars. And so how do you equip councils with a limited budget to justify these investments over and above other alternative ways that they could spend the same limited budget? So talking about them qualitatively alone is not adequate. So air quality, for example, air filtration benefits, there's evidence to show that there's improvements in poisonous air particles and air pollution from having more trees. Urban amenity, so not subcultural benefits, social cohesion, reduction in sulfur dioxide and biodiversity, supporting habitat for wildlife. So a lot of these studies will cite these benefits, but the challenge we had was citing them alone is not enough. We have to quantify them and incorporate them in a benefit cost analysis. So we can value the costs of planting them. There's an establishment cost there's a maintenance cost, there's also damage to urban utilities, damage to drainage systems and things like that. There's a cost for those. Data is available in the market. With a lot of these benefits, some of which are intangible, they're difficult to monetize. And as a result, they're frequently excluded from valuations of whether or not these assets are economically viable. And so what ends up happening is they're excluded in these benefit cost analyses. And as a result, we can portray assets like street trees as having, we can undervalue their benefit as a result. There's also a lot of challenges in terms of data, and there's methodological gaps in terms of how do you reliably and credibly value these benefits. And so the challenge becomes, if you overstate the benefit and someone looks at what you did and with a critical eye, you may have attempted to quantify a broad range of benefits, but as soon as you perceive to have overstated any one of the benefits, that anybody assessing or reviewing your work, you run a risk that they might just throw the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. And so the challenge becomes, how do you then navigate this challenging space? How do you produce a credible benefit cost analysis that values as broad a set of benefits as possible of this long list, whilst maintaining credibility in your work? The challenge becomes, just stating some benefits qualitatively effectively assumes a value of 0 if there's a business case and someone's just looking for that magic number, the benefit cost ratio. So for every $1 that is spent improving the population of street trees, what is the monetizable benefit return on investment? Is it less than the dollar that we're spending in equivalent terms? And so that's, if you understate the benefits, you might risk misportraying the trees as though they're a negative sum investment proposition. And so despite best intentions, to do credible work to advocate for these assets, representing their benefits as well as possible, these data challenges, methodological challenges, actually may lead to a situation where you're finding a benefit cost ratio of less than 1, thereby, despite acknowledging that you haven't quantified a lot of these other benefits, a policymaker or in budgeting terms, they might just see that, okay, well, there's competition for these financial resources. It seems like there's a benefit cost ratio of 2.5 to 1 if we put it towards, say, a playground. And that's the comparison that you're making. And so they tend to be, so then the challenge is to communicate these benefits and quantify as much as possible, maintain credibility without being misperceived as saying they're less beneficial than other competing uses for hard-earned taxpayers' money. And so we went about this exercise in consultation with Salisbury and Adelaide councils. There were a lot of co-designed, co-developed workshops we had with staff members to try and understand which benefits they think would be important. And they listed the benefits that you can see on the left. So urban heat mitigation, so reduction in temperatures, air pollution removal, so improvement in air quality, water management, there's the flood mitigation benefit, climate regulation, health and well-being, biodiversity support, and urban amenity. And so they listed these benefits, but the box at the bottom shows that we had to determine which ones we could defensively quantify and which ones we could not. And so it came down to just 6 that for which there was enough data to actually quantify credibly. We felt we could defend. And so in this exercise, we only quantified amenity, carbon sequestration and storage, stormwater management, that's the flood mitigation, air pollution removal, energy and emission savings, and avoided, so under health benefit, we looked at air pollution removal and avoided heat-related morbidity. So with air pollution removal and heat-related morbidity, these are healthcare service delivery expenditures in treating, for example, admissions that are related to respiratory problems related to air pollution, but also heat-related morbidity. So these are during heat waves, for example. So we applied the benefit cost analysis framework. I think without getting into the technical detail of the benefit cost analysis framework that we applied, what's most important is the objective was to come up with a benefit cost ratio. So to quantify and monetize as many of these benefits against the costs and be able to say, do we expect that the benefits will outweigh the costs, and to what extent? So by how much? We took a 30-year time horizon in this analysis. Future costs and benefits were all discounted to 2025 Australian dollar equivalent values. The idea there is that people value $1 today more than $1 next year, even less so $1 3 years from today. And there's standard guidelines for how you discount future streams of income and costs by a 7% discount rate. I'll keep referring to this discount rate because it's an important one when you're looking at investments such as trees that have a long-term return time profile, benefit time profile. So all values reported in 2025 Australian dollars, that's just to make sure that we're comparing apples and apples when we're looking at costs that are incurred over different timeframes to benefits. So present value equivalent values. Now, we held ongoing workshops with Salisbury and Unley council staff just to develop some scenarios, but also to make sure that our analysis reflects contextual differences between these two suburbs, these two LGAs. Some of the things that we looked at, one of the things that we looked at was we looked at planting a tree today going towards that 30-year horizon, meaning that we had to simulate the growth of the tree in terms of how the benefits would accrue. So it starts off slow, peaks, and then plateaus, mimicking the S growth curve. That's the biophysical process of tree growth. Starts off slow, peaks, then plateaus. And so in terms of how modeling the future benefits, they had to mirror that trajectory that we see in real life. So the scenarios that we looked at for Salisbury and Unley were quite different from these separate workshops. Salisbury's main concern was about finding financial resources to actually actively increase its lower canopy cover. Whereas Unley's main challenge was to maintain a high canopy cover against urban infill. So the scarce resource there being land itself. And so, for example, in Adelaide, we considered creative ways such as planting in street verges or in-street planting, and not just planting on the side of the street. With Salisbury, it was more about there's new streets, there's plenty of room to plant trees, there's financial challenges. How do we come up with a scenario where we're increasing street tree population that's realistic enough with a limited budget? And so in a way, it also reflects the socio-economic and demographic differences across these two suburbs. So Salisbury, we defined a business as usual scenario where current practice prevails between 2025 and 2055 over 30 years. So current intensities of street tree maintenance, but also similar rate of new trees being planted over the next 30 years. This formed the base case for comparing any other changes if we had to imagine an alternative future for these two LGAs. Under a pessimistic scenario, Salisbury imagined a do nothing, so discontinue any current investment. And the idea there is to understand the cost of inaction versus going ahead with the current effort. For Unley, it was more a damage limitation where they witness a decline, but it's about mitigating that decline. And that they considered that to be a more realistic scenario. So reducing the canopy loss. Because I think they imagine that loss through, say, natural causes as like aging under current regime are still witnessing a decline. And they consider that the base case for Unley was similar to a pessimistic. They couldn't imagine any faster losses. Salisbury imagined that a realistic would be to aspire for a 50% increase in verge coverage between now and 2055. But under best case, they imagined a 20% growth rate. And so these scenarios are depicted in terms of changes in street tree population in this graph, where for 2025, there's this current City of Salisbury street tree population, 76,000 trees, 70 different species. At this stage, it's just street tree population. The green line illustrates an optimistic scenario where under an optimistic future where the growth rate is 20%. The yellow line is a realistic, it's only 10%. The amber is what's currently happening. So there's a steady, slow decline. The red assumes an even faster decline. That's the same graph, but just shows incremental tree population change. So just takes the difference. And if you divert it from business as usual to pessimistic, a realistic, and an optimistic. So just counts number of trees lost or gained. For City of Unley, the projection was under 2025, currently 26,000 council-owned trees, street trees. And under a business as usual, which is a blue, you cannot see it in this graph because it's masked by the pessimistic. So they consider that that amber is already a pessimistic where they're experiencing a 90% decline in overall street tree population between 2025 and 2050. And so they aspire to reduce the rate of decline under a realistic scenario to 9%. Under an optimistic scenario, they assume a 1% increase in population. And again, that's just calculates the difference, so incremental. So about 4,000 between now and 2050, for example, in this slide, incremental tree population increase for annually under the optimistic scenario. We also had to contextualize the two different case studies depending on which street tree species they list as suitable from their palette. So there was quite a difference between the two cities, but I think it's reflective of differences in conditions, but also preferences. So the economic framework that we use to monetize these costs and benefits considered establishment costs, maintenance costs, infrastructure damage, so to utility infrastructure. The benefits covered amenity, which was captured mostly in terms of property value differences between households that have a mature street tree in front of them or ones that don't. And through statistical analysis, accounting for differences in number of bedrooms and other attributes, we were able to isolate the percentage that having a street tree contributes to the value of the property. Carbon benefits, we were able to quantify tons of carbon dioxide equivalent sequestered from the atmosphere and stored in the tree's biomass. And there's a model called iTree that allowed us to simulate that across the different species. And that sequestration and storage potential over the 3 years takes into account the S-curve growth model that I just spoke to, reflecting the pattern in tree how a tree matures over time. The tons of carbon sequestered and stored were monetized using the carbon price of Australian carbon credit units. This is where carbon is traded and there's a market, and the price changes between 35 and 75 historically. And so here's just an example illustration of how the tons of carbon in kgs, it's a sum of stored and sequestered, varied by species. There's the S-curve that I spoke about over time. And so I'd like to stop here because the point is we looked at a 30-year time horizon because that is the one that's recommended under the benefit cost analysis guideline under the Department of Treasury. But I think the important thing about this graph is there's benefits way beyond the 30 years, going up to 60 when it's plateauing over the lifespan of a tree, that are not even included in this accounting. Also bear in mind that benefits that are going up to 30 when you're actually peaking are discounted because they're occurring in the future to get present value equivalents. And that's what I meant by the challenge of the discount rate challenge, which can bias it can actually underestimate the benefit. And we saw this in the analysis as I'll demonstrate shortly when I get to the results. Stormwater benefits, though avoided costs, replacement costs of providing the same service of flood mitigation, for example, through flood mitigation infrastructure, drainage, avoided drainage cost, drainage infrastructure cost, investments, or what you might require to do to replace these services. Otherwise, air pollution benefits, there's a pollution removal rate, there's a health cost associated with each of some of the dangerous particles, nitrogen dioxide, for example. Energy savings, there's an electricity use rate that that we're aware of. There's an annual energy use, and most importantly, during summer, during heat waves. But we're also aware of the rate of non-renewable electricity share, because not all of that energy will be, say, generated through burning coal. So there's an adjustment for South Australia, 30% non-renewable electricity sources. Avoided heat-related costs. These are emergency department presentations during heat waves and the cost per emergency department presentation. And so that's the avoided health care service provision cost if there was a cooling effect. And this is based on studies that looked at threshold temperatures, comparing areas with versus without shading and cooling through street trees. And our colleagues at University of Adelaide developed these models. Now, the results themselves, the benefit cost ratios, I think the left graph is showing that the values themselves vary a lot. But I think overall, what I would like to draw your attention to is under the pessimistic in Salisbury, this is the social cost of inaction. This is where, remember, they looked at a scenario where they discontinued all efforts to maintain or grow the population of street trees. And that's why it's coming under 1. Now, I think the label on the left of that says millions of dollars, but it's wrong. I think it's just a ratio. It's a benefit cost ratio. What it's saying is the blue line says for every dollar invested, you get at least $1 back. And that's highlighted in blue as a threshold below which you cannot justify an investment, above which you can justify an investment. I'll draw your attention to the middle box plot for Salisbury, for example, the yellow line, which shows the median, the diamond shows the average. It says 1.25, meaning for every dollar you invest, you expect $1.25 back in return on average. It varies within that range of that box, but on average, you're expecting $1.25 for every dollar spent under a realistic, more so under the optimistic. The pessimistic falls under 1. The idea there is that without any additional investment, it still costs you to maintain, say, pruning and others in terms of safeguarding against utility, but for that investment, you're not getting any return. That's why it's less than 1. For Unley on the right, remember the pessimistic and the baseline were the same. So so then there's the 0 because we assume that the real change was deviating from the base case, which was considered pessimistic, towards a realistic with modest tree population growth and an optimistic with significantly more. And so it's just under $1.40 under realistic and nearly $1.50 under optimistic on average for Unley. How did the benefits compare? In Salisbury, the blue dominates, and that's the heat-related treatment cost saving. So avoided health costs in heat waves were important for Salisbury. I think this reflects the current canopy cover. There's a lot less, therefore there's a lot of exposure to heat as it is under the base case. So lower income areas, avoided heat costs dominate there. I think what I'd also like to focus on in this graph, in this illustration, is this only covers 6 benefits that we quantified. Remember, there's still a few that were not quantified. Now, the focus of this graph is just to show that there's a lot of variability in terms of the data that we got from councils in terms of costs. Now, this graph just shows how sensitive your estimates for total cost of street tree investment varied depending on assumptions around some of these costs. So field service costs, so watering, replacing trees, frequency of field visits to supervise. We were not given one single estimate for the cost of these, we were given a range, but this is how it impacted variability in what you assume about the total cost of trees. I think the point there is there's a need to build credible data sources to make a credible economic case for these assets. I'd also like to draw your attention to discount rate, which is third. Now, this is just under costs, which accrue in the more immediate term than benefits, yet we can still see that it's an important driver of variability in what you're assuming around costs, even more important when you're talking about benefits, because they accrue even further into the future. So to get present value equivalence, you're discounting, and that what you assume about the discount rate can actually grossly underestimate the present value equivalent of these future accruing benefits, such as for street trees. This slide is just showing that it matters which tree you plant. So some species perform better than others. And so in coming up with canopy targets, it is important to motivate your choice of species depending on which outcome you're trying to optimize. So there's a lot of variability in benefit cost ratio depending on which tree species you look at. So for Salisbury, for example, we're looking at the border brush is not returning much of a benefit cost ratio versus, say, a jacaranda. And I think this reflects different attributes of trees as well. So root depth, for example, canopy cover, trunk size, and all these will impact the magnitude of benefits that you can expect from different tree species. So in principle, we live in a system that says dollars, so we do need to underpin business cases with benefit cost analysis to be able to compare or at least advocate for urban green space against other competing land uses, but also uses for financial resources. There's a risk of underestimating street trees because it is challenging to monetize biodiversity, cultural values defensively. They're difficult to monetize, so they're often undervalued and omitted, and this illustrates that. There's a discounting bias where we're heavily discounting long-term future benefits, but we know that trees mature over decades. This can skew our results towards more immediate return competing investments such as housing, supermarkets, and other infrastructure. So benefit cost analysis alone is a start, but it needs to be supported by other analyses. But as an only determinant or basis for decision making, it risks underestimating the benefit of long-term benefit of accruing assets such as street trees and other green spaces. Now, there's a risk when you start to talk about amenity benefits because it's easier to quantify the extent to which having street trees affect property values, and that's the method we use, and it's referred to as a market-based amenity measure. But it can bring up gentrification concerns that actually mask broader livability gains from having trees. The argument being that in low socioeconomic demographic councils, if you improve trees and you're saying it'll increase the value of properties, aren't you just driving out people that cannot afford them? The argument is to look at it at a metropolitan scale, where we're advocating for broader livability gains rather than, because if it's across the metropolitan scale, the relative differences in prices across suburbs becomes a moot point. So it's more of an equity challenge. And non-market benefits, just looking at property values, do not actually capture the full picture. There's recreational benefits, there's visual appeal, there's social cohesion, there's mental well-being that are challenging to monetize, but are not captured through this simple market-based. It's conservative, easily justified, there's data for it, but nonetheless means we're underestimating this benefit. So there's a challenge there to manage some data gaps. Biodiversity, very challenging to quantify. There's a challenge in that the importance of context-sensitive planning has been illustrated by looking at Salisbury versus Adelaide, very different challenges. And so having uniform targets for canopy across the board means we lose this diversity across councils. Now, some reflections. I think there's a case to advocate for outcome-based selection criteria. By that I mean, in terms of tree species selection, just having generic targets fails to capture some of the nuances, differences between species. So it depends which ecosystem service you're trying to prioritize. It will vary by species. There's also a case to establish standard data collection monitoring systems across councils to improve credibility and accuracy when you're trying to estimate these benefits. There's a call to encourage co-design, co-development, genuine integration of genuine participation when you're modeling scenarios across councils. Imagine realistic futures as a case for comparing the current pathway to see if there's a benefit in diverting away from a business as usual towards an improved future that can be co-developed, co-designed. And this process has to be ongoing and iterative, involving key stakeholders to capture contextual realities in developing alternative futures. There's a case to prioritize investment in vulnerable, low canopy communities. I think the idea is equitable, livable at the metropolitan scale rather than just uniform canopy covers, because there's spatial differences and there's different spatial priorities. And that was revealed when we saw how important, for example, reduction in heat-related morbidity was important for Salisbury. Now, the issue with discount rates, I suggest shifting planning frameworks from just short-term project cycles to generational timescales. So that S-curve of trees going to 30 shows that we're missing out all of the other benefits that accrue beyond 30 years from now. Also, the importance of discount rate in actually underestimating future accruing benefits, thereby reducing them to very small present value equivalents, risks misportraying these assets as not as beneficial as they actually are. There's also a case to complement these numbers with actual qualitative information and community preferences and deeper values beyond just what we can quantify and monetize. And that could well involve open field text surveys asking people about what they consider to be some of their concerns, but also solutions, as well as challenging misperceptions, understanding and reconstructing some beliefs. For example, an overemphasis on risks around having street trees and damage to property, as well as risk to life, because it is the species selection and watering can actually mitigate some of these risks, and there's a challenge there. So again, when we monetize these benefits, we err towards being conservative to maintain credibility of economic analysis. We acknowledge gaps. We don't monetize mental health, social cohesion, but that presents a biased picture. That portrays a biased picture. Now, finally, there's a couple of reflections that I'd like to share. One is that, yes, there's lack of intangible benefit values because there's lack of data. Some are just outright challenging. The important point here is that we're not just missing data or appropriate methods. In relying on these numbers to stack up before we can actually justify an investment, we're in fact missing the very benefits that are often the primary justification for green space from community and health policy perspectives. So things like mental health and well-being and social cohesion. So it's not just as simple as there's no data, there's no methods, they're too difficult. We're missing more than just that. We're missing the very essential services that these assets provide. Another parting thought I have is there's a case to rethink urban trees, not so much as a nice to have, nice to look at, but as something that's essential and potentially life-saving when we're talking about public health service delivery and in the context of heating temperatures and global warming. So with that, I'd like to invite you back, Christy, to
Yes,
take some
hi, thanks,
questions.
John. Yeah, fabulous. Thank you so much for the detail and the challenges as well. So there's a few comments and questions in the chat. I might start with Rachel. There's a few kind of smaller bits and then a kind of overall framing question. So just someone that was curious where the data for around the tree species that were identified as better or worse was sourced from in your model?
Okay, so the identification of the appropriate species themselves come from the street tree palettes from these councils. So these were workshopped. These were workshopped. In terms of the data underpinning the different attributes of the trees themselves, we looked at, there's a street tree atlas. There's from botanists and our colleagues at Adelaide University. They look at tree attributes by species, looking at things like root depth, canopy cover, height, and a lot of these attributes correspond to the extent to which they deliver some of these services. For example, root depth is important for stormwater management because you're intercepting more water, and these trees there's more infiltration when there's deeper roots. Deeper roots, on the other hand, damage infrastructure as well. So they then affect the cost. And so it was down to the attributes associated with these species that then drove their estimates about what we expect in terms of the associated corresponding costs and benefits.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that directs Rachel in the area for that. And so yeah, there's some comments here just around like some really positive comments around this is really great, and this study is a powerful way to realistically address the development area and give some weight to the argument to increase opportunity of planting trees, both in policy and in design and delivery. So just, yeah, thanks for your work on the tool. And then, of course, there's that kind of counter argument, and we started talking a little bit about that before we even jumped into the session today, John, around the need, you know, there's that tension, I suppose, for some people on the line of like, why do we have economists making us justify the benefits of nature? You know, like we talked about before, your children understand the benefits of trees intrinsically, and then yeah, just really interested in yeah, the way that you frame the work and the importance of these types of tools. Why do you think that we need to justify the benefits of street trees, for example, when, you know, when there's that tension of like, shouldn't they just be recognized? Yeah. So I think you started to outline a little bit, but just, yeah, there's some, yeah, tensions for people.
Very good question. I think as an economist and as someone who does conduct this benefit cost analysis, I'm about to talk myself out of a job here, because the system within which we work requires that we justify why we use financial resources towards limited budgets, why we're choosing to use them towards one investment over another. And that's what, so the business case has a value proposition. The value proposition is underpinned by a benefit cost analysis such as the one I've presented. And so it shows, for example, there's $1.53 on average in Adelaide for every dollar spent, but it doesn't end there. It says, yes, but if I put that towards housing, I might get more. So why trees? And so we're in a stalemate where we're saying, no, these are only the benefits we could quantify. There's a lot of others that we could not. But what will stick is that number, 1:1 to 53. But it's a start. It's a start. I think you have to earn you have to get your passport to sit at that table to even bring these other intrinsic values. So it's a rite of pass, for example, to just demonstrate that you can bash the numbers and demonstrate. Then it buys you a seat at the table. You have the passport to then bring to awareness all of these other intrinsic qualitative benefits within the capitalist system that we work in.
Yeah. That's a great summary of the system that we're in, and how we communicate within that as well. And interested in how that will you keep working with Salisbury and Unley in terms of, you know, how has this tool helped them in terms of the next steps? Do you know what their intentions are with the tool and the learnings?
Yes, so phase 2 of this project involves developing a user-friendly tool that enables practitioners to put in different species, for example, different aspirations, for example, and other assumptions, and it'll access the back-end calculations and give them a dashboard in terms of what they can expect in terms of net return on their investment, considering a whole list of different design attributes. That's the goal. The question of discount rate has come up a lot in the chat, so I think I'd like to address that.
Yes, please do. Yeah, that's going to be my next one. Yeah.
That tornado chart that I showed earlier that showed that discount rate varies a lot was to show that I did not just use the 7. I then tried scenarios where I put it on a sliding scale where I started at 2 and then went as high as 9, just to gauge how important that factor is. holding all else at its median level, median assumptions, and it showed that by simply reducing this discount rate, and it is a convention after all, it's guideline, but I think it's doing such a big disservice. But it demonstrated that if you just reduce that even by 1%, the BCR, the benefit cost ratio, can jump by more than 33%, just to show that these planning cycles require short-termism for assets that outlive generations, and that's the headache.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. The generational horizons, as you mentioned at the end, is how we work towards that. Sorry, there was another question here that Geraldine, I'm sorry if I kind of smushed this question around, but because I'm trying to work out exactly what the question is, but in terms of, I think it was during your presentation as well, but like she was thinking through from a sales and marketing point of view. It seems like the tool would help to provide a positive argument, but there was, I think it was when you were talking about the equity across different areas, like if you can actually apply it, it would be a positive outcome across all of those, I think is what Geraldine's getting at. So it's just clarifying that that's where you think the data was showing that. Is that correct? In terms of that property value, and
yes, property value is a problematic one, because from whose point of view, I mean, developers will love it, but they might also see that in private land, for example, that comes in the way of subdividing, for example, infill. And so in public spaces, the point is, with property values, we're not trying to benefit the private house owner as such. We're trying to capture the amenity benefit, which goes beyond just, it goes to visual appeal. And so we're trying to capture all of this, but we're using a lower bound estimate from data that we can find in the market in terms of people's demonstrated willingness to pay, in terms of a premium that houses are fetching when you compare with versus without. But amenity benefit goes beyond just indications in terms of property value differences. So it's a start, but it's not everything. I think there's the social cohesion. I mean, it's cooler, so people will go for walks, so they'll bump into their neighbors more.
Fantastic.
That's not captured there.
There's only so much, like you were saying before, there's only so much that a tool can capture, but it's more than what was being captured before. And so, not expecting one tool to do everything as well, I think is a good reminder. Someone just had a question just regarding other tools that are out there as well. How does this tree cost measurement tool differ to the City of Melbourne's methodology, which I think some councils use in their forest tree platforms? There's City of Holdfast Bay, so they're just clarifying, because I'm sure there's hopefully all the researchers and tool creators are talking to each other as well.
Yes, I think that.
Are you aware of that one?
Yes, I've had a look. Burnside have one.
Yes.
I think that there's a heavy reliance on the iTree model, which is a US-based model that looks at benefits of trees, and it's a bit of a black box once you start to apply it in Adelaide. Now, I risk contradicting myself, because for some of the carbon benefits in terms of how much a tree species is sequestering and storing in tons over time, I did apply the carbon, the iTree model. What the iTree model does, so but within that, I was able to adapt it for the species that were relevant for Salisbury and Unley. The use of iTree model sometimes can be a bit of a black box. You check in some attributes and it spits a benefit, and sometimes in dollar terms, but it's developed with US cities in mind. And so in contextualizing it for Adelaide, you're transferring benefits in what may be a different context, and that has to be done thoughtfully. So I would say that a lot of thought went towards steering clear of the ITRI model just for those context-specific adjustments. But even when I used it, it wasn't in terms of getting dollar values. It was just in terms of getting some of the tonnage by physical measures. The point of departure with most tools is over-reliance on ITRI model. It can be taken as the Bible because it's easy to use. You punch in a number and it spits out an estimate. But I think without being able to look under the hood, it's challenging to contextualize it for the Australian context appropriately or adequately. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much, John. And we've actually come to the end of our time, and there's a few questions in there, but we'll make sure that we answer those in email. Because we're right on 5, and thank you so much for showcasing that tool in all its complexities and reminding us about the challenges of contextualizing it in our local areas as well. But yes, like someone said in the chat, it wasn't really a question, it was the chat, was it's really important to have both biologists and economists in the room talking and using their tools and different skills. And I think sometimes we expect, biologists to do that on behalf. So I think just that partnership between people that are working in the economic space and have those skill sets and how they can support people working in councils and biologists. So I think there'll be a lot of people following on and looking at how to use these tools and really ground them in practice as well, John. So thank you so much for your time, and for everyone that's joined us live, or if you watch this afterwards, we will send a follow-up email with some of those answers to some of the questions that we didn't get to and all the further research for all of you. Also, as this is the last webinar of 2025, we'll also include a link to a short feedback and topic nomination form for 2026. We're looking forward to hosting again. And for those of you that are not aware, we actually have been running this webinar now for 3 years. So there's actually 30 of these informative, fascinating webinars for you to delve back into in our back catalogue. So please look at that, and please help us design a webinar series that will help you learn more with all of us in the future. So we look forward to seeing you all in 2026, and have a lovely evening.